Capital One is our sponsor here at OSCON for a day of discussions about open source and why it is so important for new stack organizations everywhere. Capital One is at the forefront of this new open source world with several efforts such as the opening of its APIs and open sourcing core technologies such as Hygieia, its DevOps dashboard. Learn more about Capital One and its focus on developers at developer.capitalone.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at OSCON, day 2 of OSCON for us. And today we're talking about open source transformation and how open source is becoming really the core of all software, and if software is at the core of every organization, now we're seeing open source almost at the core of how businesses operate. And that's quite a change. That's quite a difference, in how we thought about open source before. And so I'm wanting to discuss today the professionalism that comes now with open source, the corporate stewardship that comes with open source, and how you approach that, and how it has evolved, and perhaps we can have some thoughts on how this looks, going forward as we see more foundations, for example, enter the fold. So with us today is Ken Owens of Cisco.
Hi, thanks for having me again, Alex. It's always fun to be here.
And Ann, I'm sorry, why don't you just yourself, Ann? I know you as Ann. I don't know your last name.
Hi, I'm Ann Wallace. I'm also from Cisco. I'm an innovation architect focusing on some of the open source initiatives we have going on at Cisco.
And Topo.
Hi, I'm Topo Powell from Capital One. Among many things at Capital One, I'm the community manager for our first open source product called Hygieia.
Mm-hmm. So Topo, perhaps this is a good place to start with Hygieia, right? And you also, we just finished talking with William Ma about Hydrograph, which is coming out. So what is Capital One's, sense of and perception of how open source serves as really something that requires professionalism, that does require, the company to think about its corporate responsibility and its corporate, corporate viewpoint,
right?
And how you think about, in terms of your overall organization.
Right. So if you notice, today we are actually talking about open source in big enterprises like financial corporations, where security and legal things are very important than anything else. But if you think about it, even 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, these companies like Capital One has been using open source, because if you ask them what programming language do you use, they will tell you it's Java. Is that not open source? They'll tell you that for the IDEs, they're going to use Eclipse. That's also open source. So I think what has happened so far is, these enterprises have been using open source, but kind of not knowing that they are using open source. So what has changed is that mindset that instead of just ignoring and using open source, let's acknowledge and then use open source, which then brings forward that thought that now that we are knowingly using open source and talking about it, let's also contribute back to the open source. So that's that shift that has happened, and I think that's what you are referring to as professionalism in open source, rather than a hobby or kind of the hidden activities that are going on in these organizations. Right.
And it actually has created kind of a whole new roles within organizations. I think your work is testament to that, isn't it?
Yes. And one of the things, so I've been at Cisco just about 6 months, and prior to that I worked at Nike for 12 years, and I saw the evolution of going from paying, for data centers, paying for Solaris, paying for this and that, going into Linux and that sort of thing. But I see the next evolution is working at a large corporation, actually being able to contribute code back. Having looking for a job recently, one of the things I find that people do, they get on GitHub and they look at kind of that as your resume.
They do.
And, working for a company where you're not able to contribute back is hard, because it's like, well, yeah, I've been doing this for 12 years, but there's nothing really to show on my public open source sort of resume. So I think that's becoming more and more of a thing within corporations as well.
Is that how you hire, Ken? Do you look at the GitHub?
I look at the GitHub for everyone I've hired, for sure. That's one of my top priorities. I also looked at like LinkedIn and Twitter to see if they say crazy things and have like a crazy like profile.
Then you hire them immediately if they do.
But I think one thing that's like really interesting is, and I've thought about this kind of like Ann and Topo as well for some time, right? That I think what's caused all this to happen is important, because that's where I think the professionalism comes in, right? Is that the pace of change and the rate at which you need to produce something unique and innovative has gotten to the point today that you can't rely on off-the-shelf software, right? By the time you need something to go and you ask your vendor to implement it, and they go through the 3-6 month process to implement it, you need something different by then, right? And then you start the cycle all over again. And so it's almost like this. It was sort of like I think you could see this coming. Like Ann was saying, she's kind of watched this evolve over time. I think you can kind of step back and say, yeah, we saw this coming, but I don't think the pace of change was necessarily seen ahead of time, right? We kind of saw moving down this path, but I still kind of felt like, even 4 years ago, it was going to still take another 10 years to get open source this prevalent, right? We have it in development, you have it in IDEs, but you don't have it in your data center operating system, right? And then all of a sudden OpenStack comes around, right? Here's an open source distribution for your data center, right?
Right.
And you could argue about the success or not success of that. That's not really the point. It's that people are now, it's part of the conversation, and it's a valid part of the conversation. It's not some crazy guy off in the corner saying, let's go think about this and do a proof of concept. It's being deployed in production systems.
It seems more professional, I think, in part because it's now a story for us, and what I mean is that, we until recently, until I think maybe 6 months ago, I was just thinking of the new stack as like a set of technologies, right? But it's apparent that there's actually really it's like you think about it, those technologies and how they're adopted and how they're used and how they're managed and how they're deployed. There's a whole set of practices here that are evolving, right? There's a sense that there's a need to really understand the processes. There needs to be processes. There needs to be approaches. There needs to be measurements. There needs to be all these different things that actually speak to professionalism. I'm curious from Capital One, how what are these sets of processes that you're implementing, right? As open source does become more professionally oriented.
Right. So there are three major things that we concentrate on as far as open source consumption is concerned. And I'm saying there are two parts of open source. One is consuming open source as a developer or infrastructure engineer or whatnot, and then the second part is contributing back to open source. As far as the consumption is concerned, we kind of analyze the whole situation and try to understand where are the fear points are, and it boiled down actually to three major things. One is legal. Is the source that we are going to use legally open source? Number two is security vulnerability. And number three, whether that particular open source tool fits in your application architecture or not. Now, the first two is kind of enterprise concern because security and legal are kind of the enterprise concern. The third one is purely on the application team. If the application architect or the team lead says, this is good for us, this is the one we want, you go ahead, have it. So we laid down some process, some are automated, some are semi-automated, to actually ease developers to get into open source and using it in their environment or application. The other part is open source contribution. We have the same things. There are legal concerns, there are security concerns, and whether open sourcing that tool kind of fits in your business model and not, right? You need to have a strategy around your open source contribution. You just do not want to just contribute here and there. There has to be some kind of synergy between the developers to actually contribute back to the open source. So these are the three things that we measure across our open source consumption and contribution process.
So, Ann, tell us about your job. What is your job? As far as open, is it to lead the interaction with open source communities? Is it to set the policies? What is it that you do in your daily work?
A little bit of everything. So I'm the tech lead on a project called Mantle. It's Cisco's open source containerization platform. So I help do some of the community work around our GitHub page or GitHub repository for Mantle. Some of that is responding to things on Gitter. Some of that is we have developers working on it, some external to Cisco, some internal. So it's helping manage the daily scrums and what people are working on, and looking at all the GitHub issues and seeing what people are asking for. Part of my job is also working with our product marketing team. They're the ones that are talking to the customers and seeing what our customers really want, and kind of balancing that between what the open source community is asking for and then what Cisco customers are asking for. And then there's the conferences and various other just internal Cisco things. But a lot of it is the balance between the corporate and, at some point we are a company, we are making money, but we also want this to continue to be open source. So it's a balance of the two.
So you report back to corporate about the progress of the organization, right? The progress of the progress of the community.
Yes.
We have the same three sort of metrics. The only thing we've added to our metrics that's different than what you kind of heard from Capital One is that we kind of look at success of a project being how much other contributors outside of our company are contributing to it, right? And we feel like that's important because I think we probably have a different use case than most enterprises have, in that we're not going to drive to Answer. We're not going to drive a major business off of something open source, right? That's not really in Cisco's portfolio, right? We're not doing something to make our products better or easier to consume. We're not solving a business problem inside Cisco with our open source effort. We're trying to solve a much broader community problem across the industry, right? And we feel like open source is the right way to do that, but we want to kind of make sure that what we're contributing to open source, we have a much larger following. And so like something like Mantle, we have maybe a quarter of the whole Mantle contributors are Cisco or Cisco paid engagements. 3/4 are other people from the community, right? And that's kind of how we want to sort of measure our success, is can we get most of the rest of the community involved in this? We can kind of shepherd it and guide it, and kind of before Ann joined, I had to take Mantle, and we take our other open source efforts too, do that same process. We talk with our legal team, we make sure there's no IP issues, we talk about what we want to open source, and when Ann and I talk about like what's next on the roadmap for Mantle, right, we're kind of separating what we can do in the open community versus what we have to kind of say, this isn't open source work because this is something that Cisco would say we want to lead in this area. We don't want to open source that. And so we try to have those internal discussions before we go to the outside, because what you don't want to do, as Ann was saying, is you don't want to have like a community say, give me this feature, and then Cisco say, okay, we're gonna work on this feature in our open source effort, and then we say, oh, well, sorry, we can't open source that, we're gonna pull that back. Right? We don't want to get into that situation where
That's troublesome.
That is troublesome, right? So we want to kind of make sure that it stays open, and everything we work on in the open source stays open.
So you're monitoring actually the projects pretty closely then, aren't you?
We are.
And it speaks to then, I think, team development, doesn't it? I mean, now you hired Ann about 6 months ago, right?
Right.
So now you have Ann on the team. I know you have Ben on the team. I don't know how big the team is overall, but you're thinking about the team and its team dynamics. So how do you think of building the team over time in terms of when you're thinking about open source projects? And I'd like to ask you that question too.
Yeah, I think the first thing I did was, and then that's why I hired Ann, and we're not quite to that point yet, so I don't want to like mislead you that we're there. But the reason I hired Ann was I want to sort of have a community focus, kind of like the role that the Topo leads, right? This community focus group that Ann will lead, that their whole job day to day is really just contributing to open source, right? They're paid by Cisco to be Cisco employees, but their main focus is really making sure the open source community is thriving and growing, and the ecosystem's getting bigger, right? Then I need another set of engineering talent that's focusing on the areas that Cisco thinks we can make a big difference in this community, right? And so like networking is a good example. Ben is more on the developer experience piece, so how do we create the right experience for a developer? kind of focusing that is not really an open source effort. They may tie into open source efforts at some point, but right now there's sort of like internal innovation work that if we could solve these big problems for developers, we could actually sell this as a service to a customer, right? So kind of separate the open source work from the non-open source work, but you can still have them loosely tied together in some ways, right? Like Shipped is the project I was referring to as a developer experience. It's not an open source project, but we don't charge for it. And it deploys on Mantle, right? It leverages Mantle for its deployment. And so it's easy to sort of, if you structure your teams in a way that you have focus on open source and focus on sort of enhancing or leveraging the open source work, then I think you get the best out of both, because you can kind of show that you're adding value to the company and you're adding value to the community.
Okay, so you guys are a bank, and and Cisco's a technology company. What are the contrasts to your approach in building out your teams to what Ken is describing?
It's almost similar, except that we build software for ourselves. In the sense that our banking application is for our customers, our tools are for our developers. What changed was that notion that, okay, we build a tool for our developers, but let's open it out and see what the other, community people are talking about and doing with the tool, so that we can learn. We know that even though we are kind of technology company and we concentrate on technology, we are not the best, right? There are other people who are better than us or even equivalent, so we want to learn from them. So that's the main reason why we open sourced Hygia to start with, to understand what we are doing is the best thing or not. What other people are doing, we want to learn from them too. That is number one. And in the process, Hygia was the first open source project sponsored by Capital One. And we learned through that whole process to understand that it's not about just open sourcing a particular project, but also an ongoing support behind that and building a community around that. So right now, through our open source office, we do have a pretty good structure around that. And for Hygia, right now we are kind of keeping the development speed on Hygia by inner sourcing, basically following the open source model and bringing it inside, getting internal capital people kind of dedicated to Hygia to some extent, not full-time, but we are also trying to hire full-time developers just to contribute on open source projects, and Hygia being the first one.
So I'm curious in how each of you approach managing your teams, and so Ann, you're on this team, right? You have interactions with Ken, right? Sometimes. That was awesome. But who else internally inside the organization are you dealing with on a daily basis, or you're checking in with on a regular basis?
A lot of my daily interactions are with our developers, and
what are you guys discussing?
just like most development, teams, we have our daily scrums,
right,
and what we're working on. We have a 3-week cycle, development cycle. So, it's typical agile, how we work. I also, on a daily basis, we have a product manager that's assigned to our team, so I'm talking to him quite a bit. I'm also talking to Cisco customers who, a lot of them just find on GitHub like Mantle, and they're like, whoa, this is Cisco, and then they talk to their SEs and are interested in it.
You think about that, that's a substantial investment. Yeah. What you guys are making, there's a lot of people who are now involved in this, and there's a lot riding on it as well. Now you've got to make some. Now we're getting into kind of issues around game theory, really. It's like, all right, so now we're making this investment in this open source project. We made the decision not to internalize it, right? So now we got to focus on it as an external project. And so now the drivers have to change. And so now you have to invest kind of the thinking and the resources behind those drivers and what those drivers might be. Maybe it's for recruiting purposes. I know that's an objective for Capital One. Maybe it's just greater levels of attention about software, for a company like Cisco that's traditionally been in the hardware market.
Right.
this is not an easy decision to make, is it? I mean, these are like, there's a lot of resources involved here.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And you mentioned that, recruitment and Capital One. Yes, recruitment is one of the goals through this process, but there are a bigger goal around that, which is, first of all, we have been using open source for a long time. It's time to give back. And we are also asking the developers to be innovative and do things faster. And when you ask me as a developer, hey, you need to go fast and you need to be innovative, I cannot go through some software, commercial software, and learn from it. I will go to GitHub and find out what's already there. So to foster that whole culture, it's kind of almost natural to open that open source world to the developers, right? And when you do that, developers will find some bugs in there, some shortcomings in some projects, and they're going to contribute back. So it's more than just recruitment. It's basically to be technologically advanced and be innovative and deliver fast. You need to embrace open source and open source technology.
And I think as a technology company, contributing back, I think it's just even internally with like our sales teams, one of the questions is always how are we making money off of this? But I think showing that we are in the open source community and have something that we're contributing back, our customers are seeing that, yes, we're evolving as well. I mean, of course, we're a technology company. We are making money off of things, but not everything you have to buy a contract for, some license for. So it gives us some validity as well, I think, with our customers.
That makes a lot of sense. So that was going to be my next question, was about the customers. Really, is like, this is almost as important as selling them a piece of software, because what you're doing, or a hardware box, whatever, because you're kind of, because this is so new, right? You're almost playing an education role to help them understand it better so that they can embark on this process. And there is that, kind of that role you play then as a leader, right? As a leader for your customers. And I expect that just helps, that helps a lot, right? That helps make it easier to make that sale.
I know one of the, just kind of back on the point you were making before this one and this point, right? I think it's important to realize that you don't contribute to open source just to contribute to open source, right?
Right.
I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, it'd be great to contribute to open source. Let me go figure out something I should contribute, right?
Yeah.
With Mantle, we have internal teams at Cisco using it, right? Kind of the point that Topo was making, right? It is being used internally. We were just trying to solve a problem, right? Here's a big problem that we wanted to solve. How would we solve that problem if we were not constrained inside some big company, right? And I think that's the same thing with Capital One, right? You solve the problem, you have some software that you think solves a problem, and the decision to open source or not is an important one, because if you open source it, you now kind of get the value of the community working with you, right? Assuming that it's a valuable piece of software, you will have people wanting to join and use it and contribute back to it. And then that kind of ties into your previous question I wanted to kind of bring up with that Ann kind of didn't get to, is that we sort of have like these quarterly summits where we kind of sit down in a room together, everyone, and say, what are our customers telling us? What are we missing? What have they liked? What have they not liked? How do we sort of take this to the next step? What sort of innovations do we want to look at that are 6 months out, 9 months out? So we kind of sit in a room, and then we're doing this next week in San Jose. We invite customers to come talk to us, and it's not like in an EBC where I sit up there at the presentation and say, here's all of our great things we're doing, right? It's more of a discussion with what are their problems, what are they trying to solve, what are they struggling with these different components of software that they're using, how can we help them solve their problems, right? And I think that to me, I think is a really key point, and I'm sure you have the same story, right? That it's really about how do you solve a problem, and then how do you help others solve that problem and contribute to solving of that problem.
Right. Interesting. So I guess, there's two topics I'd like to just address before we finish this discussion. One is, how do you communicate all this to executive leadership, right? So like the executives within the company, the CEO of the company, or the executive staff. What is it? How are you doing that?
Yeah, so for Capital One, it may be a special case because for us, the transformation that we went through over the last 4 or 5 years was kind of amazing in the sense that from waterfall to agile to manual to DevOps to closed source to open source, all these things happen at the same time almost. So that kind of is not possible unless you already have the leadership support to start with. Yeah, some part of it is kind of grassroots level movement like DevOps and automation and a little bit of open source here and there. But when you actually see that kind of bigger transformation around the organization, it had to be supported by CEOs, CIOs, CTOs, and CFOs. So in that respect, we didn't have to fight a hard battle, but yes, there are some grassroots level movements that convince the leaders that that's the way to go.
And
Lots of education.
Yeah, and at Nike, was it that way too? Did you, or were you guys was that part of the process that you were, was that a part of the process of communicating to executive leadership?
So my job, yes, at Nike was a lot of it was communicating with the senior leadership team. A lot of what I was doing around that before I left was around moving from data center to cloud. There was kind of a shift in some of the leadership that they just saw how things were evolving with the developers they were hiring, and they worked with legal for a long time to get the ability to contribute back, and that was just starting when I left.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Ken, how is it approached then? How are your, what are your, so when it comes to like your, development of Mantle, like, and communicating that, back to the executive leadership, what are some of the processes that are emerging and developing out of that?
I think the first process was sort of very early. You need to get in front of them with why you're doing what you're doing. So the more you can kind of help them understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, the faster it seems to happen the next time you want to do it. So that was sort of the first thing we did was, and then we had like a switch in leadership halfway through,
right,
as John Chambers left, right? So we kind of had to do it again with the new leadership team. But thankfully, like the old leadership team helped the new leadership team know, hey, this is what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. You should talk with them. And so I've tried to keep a very open dialogue with leaders as they come in to Cisco and help them understand why we're doing this. And for the most part, everyone gets it, right? They understand that this is the way the industry has moved, that open source is important to our strategy. And we've also had great support from, since Cisco has a central engineering group before called Cisco Development Organization, and inside there you had the CTO and architecture team under Dave Ward. And so Dave Ward was a big proponent of this, and he worked for Pankaj Patel. And so if Pankaj said we're going to do more open source, Cisco did more open source. So that helped a lot to kind of help Dave convince Dave and help convince Pankaj. Once the engineering team agrees it's good to do this, then the rest of Cisco is like going to do what the engineering team says let's do. So that helps a lot.
Yeah. So I guess my last question really is, and I'm not sure if this really affects Capital One, but it may, is we're starting to see as more, as open source becomes just the way of developing software, we're seeing the emergence of foundations, right? We're seeing the emergence of OpenStack, and you guys are participants in OpenStack. What is the effect, from your perspective, Topo, on foundations and the way that they impact your approaches and the way that Capital One, builds out its open source, policies?
Right. One thing is, about supporting these big open source foundations. So, yes, we are part of Linux Foundation. We are also part of To-Do group. It kind of helps in many fronts. One is understanding where the whole open source industry is going. And when I say open source industry, I really mean it because it is mainstream now. And then, best practices, how to adopt open source within an enterprise, how to ease things out. All these learnings are very important as an enterprise. So we are kind of engaged with them just to learn more.
Okay. And at Cisco, are you participating more in foundations than you had before? And how is that affecting? Does that affect anything? Does it not? Does it?
Well,
I mean, is it a different process than you've seen?
It's probably an interesting question
Yeah.
for Ken, but
Yeah.
we are part of, with the Linux Foundation. Ken is on the board of the
Right.
Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Right.
So it just helps us help our customers by partnering with other companies
Right.
and hearing where people are confused and having it's not really this is how you do cloud native, but having some not really standards, but guidelines and principles and bringing in projects. So I think it's just helps us understand what's going on and then having the partnerships with the other companies that are part of these foundations.
Well, Topo, Ann, thank you very much. Ken did have to run, but I want to thank you for taking the time to talk about something that's really fascinating to me, this kind of whole emergence of open source and how it's affecting, the way we perceive how our whole organizations work and operate. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Capital One is our sponsor here at OSCON for a day of discussions about open source and why it is so important for new stack organizations everywhere. Capital One is at the forefront of this new open source world with several efforts such as the opening of its APIs and open sourcing core technologies such as Hygieia, its DevOps dashboard. Learn more about Capital One and its focus on developers at developer.capitalone.com.